Tonight we are going somewhere special. We are going back in time, back to a city that burned with contradiction, that hummed with music you can still feel in your bones, and that hid secrets in plain sight on every corner. Tonight we travel to Philadelphia in the 1970s. It is a summer evening in 1974, and the air hangs thick and humid over the streets of South Philadelphia. The sun has just dipped below the row houses, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflect off the brick facades. Somewhere, a window is open, and you can hear it drifting out into the twilight. That sound, that unmistakable sound. Strings swelling, a bass line thumping, and a voice crying out about love and loss and everything in between. This is the sound of Philadelphia, and it is everywhere. But walk a few blocks in any direction, and you will find something else entirely. You will find men in expensive suits stepping out of modest row houses, men whose names were whispered but never spoken aloud. You will find a police commissioner who carried a nightstick in the cummerbund of his tuxedo. You will find neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone, where loyalty meant everything, and where some questions were better left unasked. This was Philadelphia in the 1970s, a city of soul music and shadow economies, a city of working-class dreams and backroom deals, a city where the sound coming from your radio could make you feel like anything was possible, even as the streets outside told a different story. This is the Philadelphia they do not tell you about, not the one in the history books about Benjamin Franklin and the Founding Fathers. This is the real Philadelphia. The one where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives, where music was being made that would change the world, and where the line between respectability and something else entirely was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. So close your eyes if you like. Let my voice carry you back to those humid summer nights, to those crowded street corners, to those smoky recording studios where magic was being made. Let us walk together through the Philadelphia of 1970-1971, all the way through the decade that shaped this city in ways still visible today. This is going to be a long journey. There is so much to tell you, so much that has been forgotten, so many stories waiting to be heard again. Are you ready? Good. Let us begin. To understand Philadelphia in the 1970s, you first have to understand what the city was at that moment in time. And what it was, honestly, was a city that the rest of America had largely forgotten about. Think about the major American cities of that era. New York was the cultural capital, the media capital, the place where everything seemed to happen first. Los Angeles was Hollywood, sunshine and the future. Chicago was the second city, gritty and proud. But Philadelphia was something else. Philadelphia was history, and that was both its blessing and its burden. This was the city where the Declaration of Independence was signed, the city of Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, the city where the Constitution was drafted, where the nation itself was born. Every school child in America knew about Philadelphia's role in the founding of the country. But by 1970, that glorious past felt like ancient history to the people actually living there. The city that had once been the most important in America had become, well, overlooked, overshadowed, a place that tourists visited to see the old buildings but did not stick around to explore what the city had become. And what it had become was complicated. Philadelphia in 1970 was a city of nearly 2 million people, making it one of the largest in the country. But that number was already starting to decline. The process that would reshape American cities for decades, what historians would later call white flight, was well underway. Families who could afford to were packing up and heading to the suburbs. Places like Cherry Hill in New Jersey, the main line to the west. Northeast Philadelphia, which still felt suburban even though it was technically part of the city. The factories that had made Philadelphia an industrial powerhouse were starting to close or move away. The textile mills that had employed generations of workers were struggling. The shipyards along the Delaware River were not what they used to be. Good-paying jobs, the kind that let a family buy a row house and send their kids to school and live a decent life, those jobs were getting harder to find. And the neighborhoods. Oh, the neighborhoods. They were everything in Philadelphia. They were not just places where you lived. They were identities. They were loyalties. They were, in many ways, separate worlds existing within the same city. South Philadelphia, or South Philly as everyone called it, was the Italian heart of the city. Row houses lined up tight against each other, sharing walls, sharing histories. The Italian market on 9th Street had been there since before anyone could remember. Vendors selling fresh produce and meats and cheeses, the same families running the same stalls for generations. But South Philly was not just Italian. African-American families had lived there for generations too, though the neighborhoods were sharply divided. Everyone knew which blocks were which. Everyone knew where the invisible lines were drawn. North Philadelphia was different. Once a thriving area of grand homes and tree-lined streets, by the 1970s it bore the scars of the 1964 riots. Whole blocks sat abandoned. Buildings that had burned during those terrible days still stood empty, their windows like hollow eyes staring out at whoever passed by. Poverty was concentrated there in ways that shocked visitors who wandered beyond the tourist areas. West Philadelphia spread out toward the western edge of the city, home to some middle-class black neighborhoods, to the University of Pennsylvania, to areas that ranged from comfortable to desperate, depending on which block you found yourself on. And Germantown to the north, once one of the most desirable addresses in the city, was in transition. Grand Victorian homes that had housed wealthy families for generations were being divided into apartments or sitting empty as the old money moved further out. This was the Philadelphia of 1970, a city of sharp contrasts, a city where tremendous wealth and grinding poverty existed just blocks apart, a city where the music being made in certain studios would soon conquer the world, even as the streets outside those studios struggled with problems that seemed impossible to solve. A city on the edge of transformation, even if nobody quite knew what that transformation would look like. And in the middle of all of it, in the heart of South Philadelphia, there was a neighborhood that kept its secrets better than anywhere else in the city. If you walked down 9th Street in South Philadelphia on any given morning in the early 1970s, your senses would be overwhelmed before you had gone half a block. The Italian market was alive at dawn. It had been alive at dawn for nearly a century by that point, and the rhythms of the place were as unchanging as the tides. The produce vendors were always the first to set up, their wooden crates stacked with tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and whatever else was in season. The colors were vivid even in the gray morning light, reds and greens and yellows, piled high beneath the canvas awnings that stretched out over the sidewalk. Then came the butchers, the Espositos and the D'Angelos and the Caputis, families whose fathers and grandfathers had stood behind those same counters, breaking down whole carcasses with a skill that seemed almost impossible. The sawdust on the floors absorbed the blood, and the smell of fresh meat mixed with the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries that opened at roughly the same time. And the cheese shops. Walk into one and you would see wheels of provolone hanging from hooks in the ceiling, aged Parmesan stacked in the display cases, fresh mozzarella being made right there in front of you, pulled and shaped by hands that had done this 1,000 times before. The old women would come first, the ones in black dresses who had been wearing black dresses for as long as anyone could remember, widows who had outlived husbands and sometimes sons, who shopped every day because that was what you did. You did not buy a week's worth of groceries at once. You went to the market every morning. You squeezed the tomatoes yourself. You argued with the vendor about the price, even though you both knew exactly how much you were going to pay, because the argument was part of the ritual. By mid-morning, the streets would be packed. Housewives pushing baby carriages, kids running errands for their mothers, men stopping by on their way to work or on their lunch breaks. Everyone knew everyone. You could not walk more than 20 feet without stopping to talk to someone, to ask about someone's mother, to hear about someone's cousin who had just had a baby. This was the South Philadelphia of the 1970s, a neighborhood that felt like a village, even though it was surrounded by a city of nearly 2 million people. A place where the old ways held on stubbornly against everything the modern world was throwing at it. The row houses told the story of how people lived. They were narrow, maybe 15 or 16 feet wide, but deep. 3 stories typically, with a basement below and sometimes a flat roof above, where people would hang laundry or sit on summer evenings trying to catch a breeze. The front doors opened directly onto the sidewalk. No front yards, no buffer between public and private life. And inside those narrow walls, families piled up. Grandparents on the first floor, often because the stairs got harder as you got older. Parents and children on the floors above. Sometimes an unmarried aunt or uncle tucked into a back room. Privacy was a luxury that most people could not afford. And frankly, most people did not want it anyway. Being alone meant something was wrong. Being surrounded by family, even when it drove you crazy, meant you were safe. The streets were safe too, at least the way people in South Philly measured safe. Kids played on the sidewalks until their mothers called them in for dinner. Doors were left unlocked during the day. If a stranger walked through the neighborhood, someone noticed. Someone asked questions. Word spread. But there was another kind of safety too, a different kind. Everyone in South Philadelphia understood, even if they never talked about it openly, that certain people made sure the neighborhood ran smoothly. Certain people made sure that the really bad elements, the violent criminals who preyed on ordinary folks, understood that South Philly was not the place to cause trouble. These were not the police. Oh, the cops were there, walking their beats, stopping into the same bars and cafes every day for a cup of coffee or something stronger. But the real order in South Philadelphia came from somewhere else. If you grew up in that neighborhood, you learned very young that there were things you did not ask about. Why did a certain man always have the best table at a certain restaurant? Why did people lower their voices when certain names came up? Why did your father tell you very seriously to always be polite if you ever met certain individuals? These were the mysteries of South Philadelphia, and they were not really mysteries at all. Everyone knew the answers. They just understood that speaking the answers out loud was not wise. Because there was a man who lived in a modest row house near 10th and Snyder, a man who looked like any other grandfather in the neighborhood, who kept a low profile and never made a show of his wealth, and who was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful men in the city of Philadelphia. His name was Angelo Bruno, and for 2 decades, nothing happened in South Philadelphia without his knowledge, and very little happened that he did not approve. Angelo Bruno was born Angelo Annaloro in a small town in Sicily in 1910, and he came to America as a child with his family, part of the great wave of Italian immigration that would transform cities like Philadelphia forever. His story in its early chapters was the story of a million other immigrant kids. His father opened a small grocery store. Young Angelo worked there, helped out, learned the business. He went to school for a while but dropped out before finishing, which was common enough in those days when families needed every hand they could get to make ends meet. He married his childhood sweetheart, a woman named Sue, and they stayed married for the rest of his life. They had 2 children. He lived in the same neighborhood where he grew up. In so many ways, his story was indistinguishable from thousands of other Italian-American success stories in Philadelphia, except for one detail. By the time he was a young man, Angelo Bruno had fallen in with a different kind of crowd. He had made connections that went beyond the grocery business. He had met men whose influence in Philadelphia operated in the shadows, men who ran the gambling operations and the loan sharking and the numbers games that thrived in immigrant neighborhoods where people did not trust banks and did not go to the police with their problems. Bruno was smart. Everyone who knew him agreed on that. He was not hot-headed. He did not look for trouble. But he understood power. and he understood how to accumulate it without making more enemies than necessary. He also understood something that many of his contemporaries did not, something that would define his entire career in organized crime. Violence was bad for business. The Philadelphia underworld before Bruno took control had been chaotic, bloody, unpredictable. Rival factions shot each other in the streets. Power changed hands at gunpoint. The constant warfare made everyone poorer and brought unwanted attention from law enforcement. Bruno took a different approach. When he became the boss of the Philadelphia crime family in 1959, after a complicated power struggle that could fill its own story, he immediately set about calming things down. He made peace with rivals when he could. He negotiated rather than ordered hits. He built relationships with the powerful crime families in New York, particularly with Carlo Gambino, whose friendship would prove invaluable. The newspapers would eventually call him the Docile Don, and while Bruno probably did not love the nickname, it captured something real about his style. He preferred to talk things out. He preferred to find compromises that left everyone with something. He ran the Philadelphia Mafia like a business, not like a battlefield. And for 20 years, it worked. Under Bruno, the Philadelphia crime family prospered. They controlled gambling operations throughout the city and South Jersey. They had their hands in the unions. They ran loan sharking operations that touched every neighborhood. When casino gambling was legalized in Atlantic City in 1976, Bruno already had relationships in place to profit from the new opportunity. But here is the thing that everyone in South Philadelphia understood, even if outsiders found it confusing. Angelo Bruno was not a monster. At least, not in the way people expected a mafia boss to be a monster. He lived simply. His row house on Snyder Avenue was modest by any standard. He did not drive flashy cars or wear expensive jewelry. He ate at the same neighborhood restaurants where everyone else ate. He went to church. He knew the priests and the funeral directors and the bakers and the butchers. He was a neighbor, familiar and accessible in a way that seemed impossible for a man of his power. And he had rules, important rules. Rules that shaped life in Philadelphia during his reign. The most significant rule was about narcotics. Bruno prohibited members of his organization from dealing drugs. Heroin, cocaine, marijuana, none of it was allowed. This was not because Bruno had any moral objection to drugs themselves. It was because he understood that drug dealing brought a level of law enforcement attention and community resentment that threatened everything else. The FBI was serious about drugs in a way they were not serious about gambling, and ordinary people, the people whose quiet tolerance allowed the mob to operate, would turn against you if their kids started dying of overdoses. Of course, the rule was not entirely enforced. There were always exceptions, always people operating on the edges, always deals being made that Bruno either did not know about or chose not to see. The drug trade was too profitable for the prohibition to hold completely, and this would eventually cause problems. But through most of the 1970s, the rule held. The peace held. South Philadelphia hummed along with its markets and its restaurants and its churches and its secrets, and at the center of it all was a grandfather figure who ruled from the shadows. What did it mean for ordinary people living in those neighborhoods? That is a complicated question without a simple answer. If you were a small business owner in South Philly, you probably paid something to someone at some point. Protection, they called it, though the protection being offered was often from the very people offering it. Some people resented this bitterly. Others saw it as just another cost of doing business, no different from taxes or rent. And some people honestly appreciated what they got in return. If someone caused trouble at your store, if someone tried to rob you, if someone threatened your family, there were people you could talk to. Problems had a way of getting solved. If you were a young man with limited options, the organization offered opportunities that legitimate work could not match. Not everyone joined, obviously. Most people kept their distance. But for some, it was a path to money and respect in a world where both were hard to come by. And if you were just an ordinary person going about your life, you probably did not think much about any of it. The violence that had characterized earlier eras of organized crime was absent during the Bruno years. The streets were safe. The neighborhood functioned. Whatever was happening behind closed doors did not spill out into public view. This was the arrangement, unspoken but understood by all, that defined life in South Philadelphia under the Docile Don. But Angelo Bruno was not the only powerful figure shaping Philadelphia in the 1970s. While Bruno operated in the shadows, there was another man who operated very much in the spotlight, a man whose presence loomed over the city as completely as Bruno's, though in entirely different ways. His name was Frank Rizzo, and he was the most controversial mayor Philadelphia had ever seen. Frank Rizzo was born in 1920 in South Philadelphia, just a few blocks from where Angelo Bruno would eventually make his home. But while Bruno sought the shadows, Rizzo craved the spotlight. While Bruno preferred quiet negotiation, Rizzo preferred the nightstick. Rizzo's father was a police officer, and young Frank grew up idolizing the job. He was a big kid, tall and thick, the kind of physical presence that people noticed. He played no sports, had few friends by most accounts, but he could handle himself in a fight. When he dropped out of high school and eventually followed his father onto the police force, it surprised no one. What did surprise people was how quickly he rose through the ranks, and how completely he came to embody a certain style of policing that would define Philadelphia for a generation. Rizzo earned the nickname the Cisco Kid early in his career, after a popular television cowboy character. It was meant as a compliment, a recognition of his fearlessness and his willingness to wade into dangerous situations while other cops held back. He made his reputation busting gambling dens and raiding strip clubs, and cracking down on street crime in ways that earned him loyal supporters and bitter enemies in roughly equal measure. By the 1960s, Rizzo had risen to the rank of deputy commissioner, and then in 1967 to police commissioner. It was a turbulent time to be the top cop in a major American city. Civil rights protests were reshaping the country. Urban uprisings had torn through cities like Watts and Detroit and Newark. Philadelphia had experienced its own riot in 1964, and the fear of more violence hung over everything. Rizzo responded with a simple message and an iron fist. Law and order. That was his creed. He would protect the city from chaos, from criminals, from the forces of disorder that seemed to be threatening American society from all directions. And he would do it by whatever means necessary. The most famous photograph of Frank Rizzo captured something essential about the man. It was taken in June of 1969 at a formal event, a black tie dinner of some kind. Rizzo was wearing a tuxedo, but tucked into his cummerbund, where a different man might have tucked a handkerchief or nothing at all, was his police nightstick. He had been called away from the dinner to respond to what the newspapers called a racial incident in South Philadelphia. The photograph showed him arriving at the scene, still in his formal clothes, that nightstick protruding from his waistband, ready for whatever was about to happen. To his supporters, the image was perfect. Here was a leader who would interrupt his own evening, who would rush to the streets personally, who was always ready to fight. To his critics, the image was equally revealing. Here was a man who saw every situation as a potential fight, who reached for the nightstick before he reached for dialogue, who seemed to relish confrontation. Both interpretations captured something true about Frank Rizzo. His time as police commissioner was marked by high-profile confrontations with civil rights activists and Black Power organizations. In 1967, when student protests erupted at several predominantly African-American schools, Rizzo took personal command of the police response. Witnesses described what happened next as a police riot, with officers charging into crowds of students, swinging batons, making mass arrests. Rizzo saw it differently. He believed he was protecting the city from radical elements who wanted to tear down the social order. He believed that swift, overwhelming force was the only language that certain people understood, and he believed fundamentally that the black neighborhoods of Philadelphia posed a threat that required constant vigilance and aggressive policing. Whether you see Frank Rizzo as a hero or a villain depends largely on where you stood in Philadelphia in those years. For white working-class families in South Philadelphia and the Northeast, Rizzo was their champion. He talked like they talked. He came from where they came from. He promised to protect their neighborhoods from the crime and disorder that they saw spreading through other parts of the city. When he warned about the dangers of integration, when he suggested that certain elements did not belong in certain neighborhoods, he was saying out loud what many of them said around their own dinner tables. For black Philadelphians, Rizzo represented something very different. He represented a police force that treated them as suspects first and citizens second. He represented a city government that invested in white neighborhoods while allowing black neighborhoods to decay. He represented the heavy hand of authority being brought down most forcefully on those who had the least power to resist. In 1971, Rizzo resigned as police commissioner to run for mayor. His campaign was not subtle. Law and order. Protect our neighborhoods. Restore discipline to a city that had lost its way. He did not campaign in black neighborhoods. He did not seek black votes. He built his coalition entirely from white ethnic voters, the Italians and Irish and Poles who made up the backbone of neighborhoods like South Philadelphia, and he won decisively. As mayor, Rizzo continued the approach that had defined his time as police commissioner. He expanded the police force. He backed his officers in virtually every confrontation. When the federal Justice Department sued the city over patterns of police brutality, Rizzo fought back and dismissed the complaints as politically motivated. But he also did things that his critics had to acknowledge. He invested in downtown development. He maintained close relationships with the business community. He pushed through major infrastructure projects, including a commuter tunnel that still carries passengers today. Some neighborhoods, particularly in South Philadelphia and other white areas, saw improvements under his administration. The city was divided, though. Deeply, bitterly divided. There was Rizzo's Philadelphia, and there was the other Philadelphia, and the two barely spoke to each other. In 1978, the tensions that had been building throughout Rizzo's tenure exploded into public view in a confrontation with a radical group called MOVE. Founded in 1972, MOVE was an unusual organization, part back to nature commune, part revolutionary movement. Its members adopted Africa as their surname, rejected modern technology, and lived in communal houses that neighbors complained were unsanitary and disruptive. MOVE's headquarters in the Powelton Village section of West Philadelphia became a flashpoint. The city demanded that members vacate the property. MOVE refused. The standoff escalated for months, with MOVE members fortifying their house and making increasingly provocative statements. In August of 1978, the police moved in. The resulting confrontation was chaotic and violent. A police officer was shot and killed. 9 MOVE members were arrested and eventually convicted of murder, though questions about what exactly happened that day would linger for years. The MOVE confrontation was not the end of the story between the city and the organization. It would culminate, horribly, in 1985, years after Rizzo had left office, when police dropped a bomb on a MOVE house in West Philadelphia, killing 11 people, including 5 children, and setting fire to 65 neighboring homes. But that tragedy was in the future. In the 1970s, the confrontation with MOED was just one chapter in the ongoing conflict that defined Rizzo's Philadelphia. A city at war with itself, it sometimes seemed. A city where the man in charge commanded fierce loyalty from some and fierce opposition from others, with very few people in between. By 1979, Rizzo was barred by the city charter from running for a 3rd consecutive term. He tried to change the charter through a ballot initiative, famously urging his supporters to vote white, words he later admitted were a poor choice. The initiative failed. His time as mayor ended, but the culture he had established in the police department, the confrontational approach, the sense that certain neighborhoods required different kinds of policing, the loyalty between officers that sometimes seemed to override accountability, that culture would persist for decades after Rizzo himself was gone. Frank Rizzo died in 1991 while running yet again for mayor, the job he never stopped wanting. His legacy remains contested to this day. A statue of him stood in front of City Hall for years before being removed in 2000 amid protests over police brutality. A mural of him in the Italian market, one of the most frequently defaced pieces of public art in the city, was finally painted over around the same time. He was, depending on who you ask, the last great defender of working-class Philadelphia, or the embodiment of everything that divided and damaged the city. Perhaps he was both. Cities are complicated, and the people who shape them are complicated too. But there was another force shaping Philadelphia in the 1970s, a force that brought people together rather than driving them apart. A force that started in cramped recording studios and spread out to conquer the world. A force that still makes people smile when they hear it, decades later. It was called the Sound of Philadelphia, and it changed music forever. On a quiet street in downtown Philadelphia, not far from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, there was a building that looked unremarkable from the outside. Red brick a few stories tall, the kind of structure you would walk past without a second glance. But inside that building was Sigma Sound Studios. And inside Sigma Sound Studios, some of the most important music of the 1970s was being created. The story of Philadelphia soul begins with two young men who grew up in the city and shared a vision. Kenny Gamble was born in 1943 in South Philadelphia, just a few blocks from the Italian market. Leon Huff was born in 1942 in Camden, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River. They met in the early 1960s, discovered that their musical sensibilities aligned almost perfectly, and began a partnership that would reshape popular music. Gamble was the words man, the one who crafted lyrics that spoke to everyday experiences of love and heartbreak and social struggle. Huff was the music man, a pianist with an extraordinary ear for arrangements that combined sophistication with accessibility. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. By the late 1960s, Gamble and Huff had already scored some hits working with various artists and labels. But they wanted more. They wanted to build something of their own, a record company that could do things their way, that could support a stable of artists and a house band, that could create a distinctive sound, identifiable as Philadelphia. In 1971, they founded Philadelphia International Records, and everything changed. The key to the Philadelphia sound was not just Gamble and Huff, though their songwriting and production were essential. The key was also the extraordinary group of musicians they assembled, a collective that came to be known as MFSB, which stood for Mother, Father, Sister, Brother. There were roughly 30 musicians who rotated through recording sessions at Sigma Sound, a core group of maybe a dozen who appeared on virtually everything. Bobby Martin did many of the arrangements, crafting those lush string parts that became a signature of the Philadelphia sound. Ronnie Baker played bass, laying down grooves that made you want to move. Earl Young was on drums, keeping time with a precision that anchored even the most complex arrangements. Norman Harris played guitar. There were horn players and string players and percussionists, all of them working together with an almost telepathic understanding of what each song needed. These musicians did not just play what was written on the page, they contributed ideas. They shaped the sound. The bass lines that made Philadelphia soul so distinctive often emerged from the studio sessions themselves, with Ronnie Baker and the other musicians working out the parts that would become the foundation of classic recordings. The sound they created was unlike anything that had come before. It built on the traditions of rhythm and blues and gospel that had shaped Black American music for decades. But it added something new. The strings, the orchestral sweep, the sense of grandeur that lifted even simple love songs into something that felt epic. And the drums, that hi-hat pattern, that swooshing rhythm that seemed to propel every song forward, that would become the foundation of disco. You can draw a direct line from what was happening at Sigma Sound Studios in the early 1970s to what would happen on dance floors around the world by the end of the decade. The hits started coming, and they did not stop. In 1972, the OJs released Backstabbers, an album that announced Philadelphia International Records as a major force in popular music. The title track was a masterpiece of paranoia set to a groove, a song about the people smiling in your face while plotting your downfall. It captured something about the moment, about the sense that the world was not quite what it seemed, that you had to watch your back even among friends. But it was Love Train that really broke through. Released as a single in 1972, it hit #1 on the pop charts in early 1973. The message was simple and universal. People all over the world, join hands, start a love train. A love train. In a country still divided by war and racial conflict, it was a song that promised something better. And that infectious groove, built on the Philadelphia sound, made it impossible not to move. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes had been around for years before they connected with Philadelphia International. But the partnership transformed them. The real star of the group was their lead singer, Teddy Pendergrass, a voice of such raw power and emotional depth that he could make you believe every word he sang. When they released If You Do Not Know Me By Now in 1972, it was a revelation. A ballad about a relationship breaking down, sung with such intensity that you felt like you were eavesdropping on something private. And then there was Billy Paul, Me and Mrs. Jones hit #1 in December of 1972, and it was a scandal wrapped in velvet. The song was explicitly about an extramarital affair, two people meeting at the same cafe every day, knowing their relationship was wrong but unable to stop. In an era when popular music still generally avoided such frank discussions of infidelity, the song felt transgressive, and Billy Paul sold it completely, his voice aching with guilty pleasure. In 1974, the musicians of NFSB stepped out from behind the artists they normally accompanied and released T-Sop, which stood for the sound of Philadelphia. The song had been commissioned as the theme for Soul Train, the dance show hosted by Don Cornelius that broadcast black music and culture into homes across America every Saturday morning. Don Cornelius had come to Philadelphia looking for a theme song, and he pushed Gamble and Huff to make the tempo faster, more danceable, something that would get people moving. The result was an instrumental that captured everything the Philadelphia sound had become. The strings sweeping upward, the horns punctuating the rhythm, the drums driving everything forward. And that bass line, that irresistible groove that made standing still impossible. TSOP went to #1 on the pop charts, the first television theme song ever to achieve that distinction. Every week, millions of Americans heard the sound of Philadelphia before they even watched the show. There were so many others. The Stylistics with their falsetto harmonies, the Intruders with their smooth ballads, the 3 Degrees who sang backing vocals on T-Sop and went on to international success, particularly in Britain where they became favorites of the royal family. The Tramps, who would score one of the biggest disco hits of all time with Disco Inferno a few years later, built on the foundation laid at Sigma Sound. What made Philadelphia soul special? Why did it resonate so deeply, not just with black audiences, but with everyone? Part of it was the production quality. Gamble and Huff understood that their music needed to sound as good as anything coming from Motown or anywhere else. They invested in their studio, in their musicians, in the arrangements that surrounded their vocalists. The records that came out of Philadelphia International had a polish, a shimmer that set them apart. Part of it was the songwriting. Gamble in particular had a gift for lyrics that spoke to everyday experiences. Love and loss, yes, but also social consciousness. Songs like Wake Up Everybody and For the Love of Money addressed the problems of the world while still making you dance. And part of it was the timing. The early 1970s were a moment when American culture seemed to be opening up, when the barriers between black and white audiences were breaking down faster than they ever had before. Philadelphia soul was sophisticated enough to appeal to listeners who might not have considered themselves fans of rhythm and blues, while still being rooted deeply enough in the black musical tradition to feel authentic. The music that came out of Sigma Sound Studios was, in its way, a unifying force for a city and a country that needed one. In a Philadelphia divided by race and class, by the tensions of the Rizzo years, by the economic struggles that were reshaping urban America, the sound coming from those recording sessions brought people together on dance floors and in living rooms and on car radios. Whatever else was happening in Philadelphia in the 1970s, that music was happening too. And it mattered. But the streets of Philadelphia after dark were not all about music and dancing. There was another side to the city's nightlife, a side that ran on different rhythms entirely. And perhaps no cultural artifact captured the spirit of 1970s Philadelphia better than a film that nobody expected to succeed. In 1976, the same year that Philadelphia celebrated the bicentennial, a low-budget movie opened in theaters that would change the way America saw the city forever. It was called Rocky, and it starred a virtually unknown actor named Sylvester Stallone, who had also written the screenplay. The story was simple enough. Rocky Balboa was a small-time boxer from South Philadelphia, a guy with more heart than talent who worked as a collector for a local loan shark when he was not training at the gym. He got an unlikely shot at the heavyweight championship of the world, and the film followed his journey from nobody to contender. What made Rocky resonate was not the boxing. It was Philadelphia. Stallone shot the film on location, using the actual streets and neighborhoods that the story was about. The Italian market appeared on screen, the vendors and their stalls providing an authentic backdrop for scenes of Rocky's daily life. The row houses of South Philadelphia, the same row houses where Frank Rizzo had grown up and where Angelo Bruno lived, became characters in the story. And then there were those steps. The Philadelphia Museum of Art sits at the end of Benjamin Franklin Parkway, a grand neoclassical building that houses one of the finest art collections in the country. But what made it famous was not the art inside. It was the 72 stone steps leading up to the entrance. In the film's most famous sequence, Rocky runs through the streets of Philadelphia at dawn, his training reaching its climax. He runs past the Italian market, past the docks, through the empty early morning streets, and then he reaches the art museum. He runs up those steps, all 72 of them, and at the top he raises his arms in triumph as the music swells. That image, that moment became iconic. Tourists still run up those steps today, raising their arms at the top, recreating a moment from a movie made nearly 50 years ago. There is a bronze statue of Rocky at the base of the steps now, one of the most photographed attractions in the city. What Rocky captured, beyond the specific story it told, was something about the working-class spirit that Philadelphians recognized as their own. Rocky Balboa was not sophisticated. He was not particularly bright. He made questionable choices and hung around with questionable people. But he had heart. He refused to give up. He went the distance. That was how many Philadelphians saw themselves, overlooked by the rest of the country, struggling with problems that seemed insurmountable but still fighting, still getting up when they got knocked down, still believing that tomorrow might be better than today. The film was not entirely accurate, of course. It romanticized the poverty and the violence, made them seem picturesque rather than devastating. The loan shark that Rocky worked for was portrayed as a basically decent guy, which was not exactly how most loan sharks operated. The boxing world depicted in the film was cleaner than the real boxing world, which was deeply entangled with organized crime. But accuracy was not really the point. Rocky was a fairy tale, and like all good fairy tales, it captured an emotional truth even when the details were invented. The truth it captured was about hope, about the possibility of transformation, about the dignity of people who had been counted out. Joe Frazier, the real heavyweight champion who had grown up in Philadelphia and trained fighters at his own gym in the city, had mixed feelings about the movie. On one hand, it brought attention to the Philadelphia boxing scene that he had been part of for years. On the other hand, there was something strange about a fictional boxer becoming more famous than real fighters who had actually accomplished what Rocky only achieved in the movies. Philadelphia's relationship with its cinematic image would remain complicated for decades to come. The city became a popular filming location, with movies like Trading Places and Blowout using its streets and landmarks. But Rocky was the film that defined how America thought about Philadelphia, for better and worse. The gritty, scrappy, never-say-die spirit. The ethnic neighborhoods with their traditions and their loyalties. The sense that this was a place where real people lived real lives, not a glamorous fantasy, but something solid and authentic. That was the Philadelphia that Rocky showed the world, and that image persisted long after the 1970s had ended. Let us pause here for a moment to think about what daily life actually felt like for ordinary people living through this era. Imagine waking up in a row house in South Philadelphia on a summer morning in 1974. The heat has already started to build by 7 in the morning, and you can hear the sounds of the neighborhood coming alive through your open window. The milkman still made deliveries in those days, and you might hear the clink of bottles being set on doorsteps. The produce vendors at the Italian market were already at work, and if the wind was right, you could catch the smell of fresh vegetables and ripe fruit drifting through the streets. Your mother is already in the kitchen making breakfast. The coffee is percolating on the stove, that distinctive sound of air bubbling through the water, and the smell fills the small house. There might be eggs frying, or maybe just toast if it is a lean week before payday. The radio is on, tuned to WDAS or what, the stations that played soul music all day long. The OJs might be singing about love trains, or Billy Paul might be crooning about Mrs. Jones. The music was the constant background of life, always there, always familiar. You get ready for work, or for school if you are young enough, pulling on clothes that your mother washed by hand and hung on the line in the tiny backyard. Air conditioning is not something most families have, so you dress light and accept that you are going to sweat. The bus stop is 2 blocks away, and you walk past people you have known your entire life. Mrs. D'Angelo is already sweeping her sidewalk, which she does every single morning regardless of weather. Mr. Patterson is opening his barber shop, arranging the chairs and the magazines, getting ready for the day's customers. Someone waves to you from a stoop, asks about your mother, reminds you to say hello to your father. This was the texture of life. Dense and interconnected, the opposite of the anonymous suburban existence that more and more families were choosing. Every action was witnessed. Every relationship mattered. Privacy was scarce, but so was loneliness. At work, if you were lucky enough to have work, the conversations would touch on everything happening in the city. Did you hear about what happened last night on such and such corner? Can you believe what Rizzo said now? Did you catch the game? The workplace was an extension of the neighborhood, another space where lives intertwined and information circulated. Lunch might be a hoagie from the corner shop, that distinctly Philadelphia sandwich of Italian meats and cheeses piled onto a long roll, dressed with oil and vinegar and hot peppers if you liked them. The word hoagie itself was Philadelphia's own contribution to the language, and ordering one anywhere else required explanation. After work, the evening stretched out with possibility. In summer, people sat on their stoops and watched the world go by. Kids played in the streets until their mothers called them in. Someone might have a radio going, the music drifting out into the twilight. Someone else might be grilling in an alley, the smell of meat and charcoal mixing with the city air. If it was Friday or Saturday night, you might get dressed up and go out. To a club, where they played the music you loved. To a bar where you knew the bartender and half the customers. To a party at someone's house, the furniture pushed back to make room for dancing. the records spinning until the neighbors complained or until exhaustion set in. And underneath all of this, always was the knowledge that the city was changing, the factories closing, the neighborhoods shifting, the future uncertain in ways it had not been for your parents or your grandparents. The world you knew was not going to last forever, even if you could not quite see what would replace it. This was the Philadelphia of the 1970s, not an abstraction, not a set of historical facts, but a lived experience. Hot summers and cold winters, music everywhere, family close, sometimes too close, a city that was struggling but not giving up, that was changing but still recognizable, that was both worse than it used to be and better than some people wanted to admit. The men who shaped this city, Bruno and Rizzo and Gamble and Huff and all the others, were just part of the story. The real story was the millions of ordinary people who woke up every morning and did their best to make decent lives for themselves and their families. The people who never made the newspapers, but who were the actual substance of the city, its heart and its soul. Their Philadelphia is largely gone now. The row houses remain, but the families have scattered. The Italian market survives, but transformed. The music endures, but the studios where it was made have closed or moved on. The city keeps changing, as cities do, becoming something new while holding fragments of what it used to be. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear echoes of that era, in the music that still plays on certain radio stations, in the stories that old-timers tell if you give them a chance, in the neighborhoods that still bear the marks of what they once were, even as they become something different. That is why we tell these stories, not just to remember what was, but to understand what persists, to recognize that the present is built on the past, layer upon layer, and that the cities we live in today are haunted, in the best sense, by all the cities there used to be. Philadelphia in the 1970s, a time of soul music and shadow economies, a time of civic pride and civic strife, a time when the future was uncertain but the present was vivid, alive unmistakably itself. Thank you for spending this time with me, traveling back to a city that existed and a world that has passed. I hope the journey has been meaningful. I hope the stories have stayed with you. And I hope, wherever you are tonight, that you find some of the same things those Philadelphians were looking for. Connection, community, meaning, hope. Even in difficult times, especially in difficult times. Rest now if rest is what you need. Let the sounds of that distant city fade into peaceful silence. Let the characters we have met tonight take their places in your memory, ready to be recalled whenever you want to visit them again. The Philadelphia of the 1970s will be here whenever you want to return. The stories do not go anywhere. The music still plays. The past is always waiting, patient and eternal, for anyone who wants to listen. Good night, dear friends. Sweet dreams. And thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being here. Until we meet again. There was something about the way neighborhoods worked in Philadelphia that outsiders often found hard to understand. The boundaries were not just geographic. They were cultural, historical, almost tribal. Take Kensington, for example. This was a neighborhood in the northern part of the city that had once been the textile capital of America. The mills that lined the streets had employed tens of thousands of workers, producing fabric that was shipped around the world. Families had worked in those mills for 3 and 4 generations, children following parents following grandparents, into the same brick buildings where the machinery never stopped. By the 1970s, those mills were dying. The textile industry was moving south, where labor was cheaper and unions were weaker, or overseas where labor was cheaper still. One by one, the factories that had defined Kensington for a century were closing their doors. The buildings sat empty, their windows broken, weeds growing up through the cracks in the pavement. The workers who had spent their lives in those mills found themselves without jobs, without prospects, watching the only world they had known disappear. These were not people who had been to college. These were not people with transferable skills. They knew how to run the machines that made fabric, and when those machines went silent, so did their futures. The despair was tangible. You could see it in the bars that filled up at 3 in the afternoon, with men who had nowhere else to go. You could see it in the homes that were not being maintained, because there was no money for maintenance. You could see it in the young people who were leaving, heading to the suburbs or to other cities, anywhere that seemed to offer more opportunity than a dying industrial neighborhood. And yet the community held on. The Catholic churches that anchored each block continued their services, continued to provide what comfort and structure they could. The corner stores stayed open even when customers were scarce. The social clubs where men had gathered for decades continued to meet, the same faces around the same tables, talking about the old days when things were different. This was happening all over industrial America in the 1970s. But it hit Philadelphia particularly hard. The city had been built on manufacturing, on the assumption that there would always be work for people willing to labor with their hands. When that assumption proved false, the foundation of whole neighborhoods crumbled. Germantown told a different but related story. This was a neighborhood that had once been among the most desirable in the city, home to grand Victorian houses and tree-lined streets that felt almost suburban, even though they were well within the city limits. The decline of Germantown had begun earlier, in the 1950s and 60s, as white families moved to the actual suburbs and African American families moved in. This transition was not always peaceful. Real estate agents engaged in what was called blockbusting, deliberately stoking fears about racial change to convince white homeowners to sell cheap, then reselling to black buyers at inflated prices. The practice destroyed wealth and destroyed communities, leaving behind resentment on all sides. By the 1970s, much of Germantown was poor, its grand houses divided into apartments or falling into disrepair. But there were also pockets of stability, black middle-class families who had invested in the neighborhood and were determined to maintain it. These families formed block clubs and civic associations, fought against the decay, held on to hope that things could get better. The contrast between what Germantown had been and what it was becoming was stark. On one block, you might see a beautifully maintained Victorian home, its garden neat and its paint fresh. On the next block, you might see a house with boarded windows and a caved-in porch, clearly abandoned, probably stripped of its copper pipes and anything else of value. This was the reality of neighborhood change in 70s Philadelphia. Not a smooth transition, but a jagged one, block by block, house by house, with some people holding on and others letting go, with hope and despair living side by side. West Philadelphia, home to the University of Pennsylvania and sprawling out toward the city line, had its own dynamics. The presence of the university created islands of relative prosperity in a sea of struggling neighborhoods. Students and professors lived in grand houses near campus, while just a few blocks away, families lived in poverty. The university itself was controversial. It had a history of expanding into surrounding neighborhoods, buying up properties and displacing longtime residents. Town and gown tensions, as they were called, were real and sometimes bitter. The community saw the university as a rich institution that took from the neighborhood without giving back. The university saw the community as an obstacle to its growth and development. And then there was Center City, the downtown core where the skyscrapers rose and the businesses operated and the tourists came to see the historical sites. Center City in the 1970s was cleaner and safer than many of the surrounding neighborhoods, but it too was struggling. The department stores that had defined downtown shopping were losing customers to suburban malls. Office buildings had vacancy rates that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The streets that had once bustled with shoppers and workers were quieter now, emptier. There were efforts at urban renewal, grand plans to revitalize downtown and reverse the decline. Some of these plans succeeded. The Society Hill neighborhood, just blocks from Independence Hall, was transformed from a slum into one of the most expensive zip codes in the city through a combination of public investment and private restoration. Queen Village and Fairmount saw similar revivals, colonial-era houses rescued from decay and returned to something like their former glory. But these success stories were limited. For every neighborhood that was revitalized, there were 10 that continued to decline. The money and attention went to areas that could be marketed to tourists or to young professionals, while the working-class neighborhoods, where most Philadelphians actually lived, were left to struggle on their own. The city government, caught between shrinking tax revenues and expanding needs, could not keep up. Services deteriorated. Schools struggled with inadequate funding. Infrastructure that had been built generations earlier was wearing out without money for repairs. The sense of being abandoned by the broader society was widespread and not entirely unjustified. This was the context in which people lived their lives. Not just the famous figures and the dramatic events, but the everyday reality of navigating a city that was changing in ways that felt beyond anyone's control. You could be nostalgic for the past while acknowledging that the past had its own problems. You could be hopeful for the future while seeing precious little evidence that the future would be better. You could love your city while being angry at what was happening to it. Philadelphia in the 1970s was not one thing. It was many things, simultaneously. It was Angelo Bruno's domain and Frank Rizzo's stage. It was Sigma Sound Studios and the Italian market. It was desperate poverty and fierce pride. It was neighborhoods dying and neighborhoods fighting to survive. It was the end of an era and the beginning of something not yet defined. And through it all, the music played. On the radio, in the clubs, on the street corners where someone always had a radio going. The sound of Philadelphia provided a soundtrack for a city in transition, songs about love and struggle and hope that spoke to what people were actually living through. When the OJs sang about people all over the world joining hands, they were singing to a city that was deeply divided. When Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes sang about not knowing someone who claimed to love them, they were singing to people whose certainties had collapsed. When Billy Paul sang about Mrs. Jones, about stolen moments and guilty pleasures, he was singing to people who understood that life was complicated and that easy answers were hard to find. The music did not solve anything. It could not bring back the factories or heal the racial divisions or make the future less uncertain. But it provided comfort. It provided joy. It reminded people that beauty could exist even in difficult circumstances, that creativity could flourish even when so much else was struggling. That was the gift of Philadelphia's soul. Not escape from reality exactly, but transformation of reality. Taking the raw materials of urban life in the 1970s and turning them into something that moved people literally and emotionally, something that made them dance and cry and feel less alone. Decades later, when people think about Philadelphia in the 1970s, it is often the music they remember first. The music has outlived the problems, outlived the controversies, outlived most of the people who created it. It remains as a testament to what was possible, to what human creativity could achieve even in the most challenging circumstances. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this era, that cities are never only their problems, that even in times of decline and division there is always something being created, always something worth remembering. Philadelphia in the 1970s had more than its share of troubles, but it also had MFSB and the OJs. It had row houses filled with families who loved each other. It had corner stores and Catholic churches and block parties and high school football games. It had all the things that make life worth living, even when life is hard. That is the Philadelphia worth remembering. Not a sanitized version, not a romanticized fantasy, but the real city with all its contradictions. A city that was struggling and surviving and sometimes even thriving. All at the same time, a city that was home to millions of people who deserve to have their stories told. This has been their story. I hope I have done it justice. When the sun went down in Philadelphia, The city transformed. The daytime rhythms of work and commerce gave way to something different, something that carried its own promises and its own dangers. The disco scene was emerging in the mid-1970s, and Philadelphia was at the center of it. Clubs like Artemis downtown drew crowds who wanted to dance to the sounds being invented in their own city. The dance floors filled with people dressed in their finest, moving to the music that seemed to capture something essential about the moment. There was a democratic quality to the early disco scene that is sometimes forgotten today. It emerged from black communities, from Latino communities, from gay communities, from people who had been excluded from mainstream entertainment, and created something of their own. Before it was conquered by the mainstream, before Saturday Night Fever turned it into a white phenomenon, disco was an underground movement that belonged to the margins. Philadelphia's contribution to disco was immeasurable. The studio musicians at Sigma Sound were essentially inventing the genre in real time, figuring out the rhythms and arrangements that would make disco what it became. The songs that came out of Philadelphia International Records were among the first to truly capture the disco sensibility, even before anyone was using that word to describe them. But not everyone was dancing. In the neighborhoods away from the clubs, a different kind of nightlife was unfolding. The numbers game had been running in Philadelphia for as long as anyone could remember. Every day, people placed their bets with runners who moved through the neighborhoods collecting slips and cash. Pick 3 numbers. If your numbers hit, you got paid. If they did not, you tried again tomorrow. It was illegal gambling, technically, but it was so deeply embedded in the culture of certain neighborhoods that the line between legal and illegal barely mattered. The numbers employed people. The numbers created a web of economic activity that touched thousands of lives, and the numbers, of course, were controlled. In South Philadelphia and other Italian neighborhoods, the numbers were part of Angelo Bruno's domain. In the black neighborhoods west of Broad Street, a different organization had emerged to control the action. The Black Mafia, as it came to be known, had formed in the late 1960s as African-American criminals began to organize in ways that mirrored what the Italian mob had done decades earlier. By the early 1970s, they had carved out territory of their own, controlling gambling and drug dealing in predominantly black areas of the city. There was an uneasy relationship between the Black Mafia and Bruno's organization. Bruno had ceded some territory, rather than fight a war that would have been bloody and unprofitable. A rough boundary was understood. Italians east of Broad Street, African Americans west of it. The reality was more complicated, of course, with overlap and friction at the edges, but the basic division held. The Black Mafia was more violent than Bruno's organization, more willing to use force to settle disputes. Its members were younger, hungrier, less patient with the old ways of doing things, and they were deeply involved in something that Bruno had tried to prohibit: the drug trade. Heroin was devastating parts of Philadelphia in the 1970s, particularly in North Philadelphia, where poverty and hopelessness created a market for anything that offered escape. The abandoned buildings that dotted the landscape became shooting galleries where addicts gathered to get high. The corners became open-air drug markets where transactions happened in plain sight. This was the Philadelphia that did not show up in the tourism brochures or the newspaper articles about the bicentennial celebrations. This was the Philadelphia of vacant lots and burned-out buildings, of mothers searching for lost children and children growing up in chaos, of a drug epidemic that claimed lives and destroyed families with an efficiency that seemed almost purposeful. The police were present, but seemed unable or unwilling to stop what was happening. The corruption that defined the Rizzo era extended to the drug trade, with accusations that certain officers were paid to look the other way, while certain dealers operated freely. Whether this was officially sanctioned or just a result of individual officers taking advantage of their positions, the effect was the same. The drugs kept flowing. For ordinary people trying to live decent lives in these neighborhoods, the nighttime brought real fear. You knew which corners to avoid. You knew which blocks became dangerous after dark. You taught your children to recognize the signs of trouble and to run in the other direction. You prayed, if you were the praying type, that the violence that seemed to erupt randomly would somehow pass your family by. And yet, life went on. It always does. People fell in love and got married and raised children. They went to church on Sunday and cookouts in the summer. They found moments of joy amid the struggle, because that is what people do. The Philadelphia of the 1970s was not only its problems, it was also the resilience of people who refused to give up on their city or on each other. The street corner culture that has become so associated with urban Black America was very much alive in the Philadelphia of this era. Men gathered on corners not just to sell things, legal or otherwise, but simply to socialize, to talk about sports and politics and women, to watch the world go by and comment on what they saw. These gatherings had their own rituals, their own hierarchies, their own codes of conduct that were invisible to outsiders, but perfectly clear to those who participated. Music was everywhere, not just in the clubs and on the radio, but on the streets themselves. Portable radios, what would later be called boomboxes, carried the sound wherever people went. The bass lines of Philadelphia soul provided the soundtrack to everyday life, a constant presence in the background of everything that happened. And then there was the number. Every day people checked to see if their number had hit. It was a form of hope, a belief that luck might smile on you even when everything else seemed stacked against you. The numbers runner was a familiar figure, trusted by his customers, paying out winnings reliably because his reputation depended on it. In neighborhoods where banks were scarce and distrust of institutions ran deep, the numbers provided a financial system of sorts, informal and illegal but functioning. This was the Philadelphia night, dancing and dealing. Music and mayhem, joy and sorrow existing side by side, block by block, sometimes house by house. A city that contained multitudes that could break your heart and lift your spirits in the same evening. By 1976, Philadelphia was preparing for something unprecedented. The nation was turning 200 years old, and the city where it had all begun was going to throw a party. The bicentennial had been planned for over a decade, and Philadelphia was determined to be at the center of it. This was, after all, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed, where the Constitutional Convention had met, where the nation had been born in ways both symbolic and literal. No other city could claim that heritage, and Philadelphia intended to make the most of it. But celebrating America's birthday in a city struggling with all the problems that defined urban America in the 1970s was complicated. The tourists would come. Yes, they would visit Independence Hall and see the Liberty Bell and walk the cobblestone streets of the historic district. But just beyond those tourist zones was a city that did not fit the patriotic narrative so neatly. The preparations revealed the tensions. City officials wanted to present a sanitized version of Philadelphia to the world, a cleaned-up historic district surrounded by the appearance of prosperity and order. But the reality of West Philadelphia, of North Philadelphia, of the struggling neighborhoods that made up most of the city's geography, could not be entirely hidden, and there were those who questioned whether celebration was even appropriate. What did 200 years of American freedom mean to communities that had been enslaved for much of that history? What did patriotic speeches mean to people who felt that their government had abandoned them, that the promises of the nation's founding documents remained unfulfilled? These questions simmered beneath the surface as the bicentennial approached, but they did not prevent the celebration from happening. On July 4, 1976, Philadelphia was the center of the world, or at least of American attention. Millions of visitors streamed into the city. The historical sites were packed with tourists eager to touch the places where history had been made. Parades wound through downtown streets. Fireworks exploded over the Delaware River. For one day at least, the problems seemed distant. The mood was festive. Families who had saved for months to make the trip posed for photographs in front of Independence Hall. Children waved small American flags and ate ice cream and marveled at the crowds. President Gerald Ford came to Philadelphia for the occasion, as did dignitaries from around the world. Speeches were given about the meaning of American democracy, about the ideals that the founders had articulated 2 centuries earlier, about the ongoing project of building a more perfect union. If you were there that day, you might have felt genuinely moved. Despite everything, despite all the problems and contradictions, there was something powerful about standing in the place where it all began, about being part of a celebration that connected you to centuries of history. The cynicism could wait. For one day, there was room for something simpler. But the day ended, the tourists went home, and Philadelphia remained what it had been before the celebration began. A complicated city wrestling with problems that had no easy solutions. The bicentennial did leave some lasting marks on the city. The renovations to the historic district remained. The attention brought to Philadelphia's role in American history helped sustain tourism as an industry for decades to come. And there was a new civic pride, a sense among some Philadelphians that their city mattered in ways that went beyond its current struggles. But the moment passed. By 1977, the bicentennial was receding into memory, and the city was dealing with the same issues it had faced before. The factories were still closing. The population was still declining. The tensions between communities were still simmering, and changes were coming that would transform the city in ways no one quite anticipated. As the 1970s drew to a close, the world that had defined the decade was beginning to unravel. Atlantic City's casinos opened in 1978, bringing legal gambling to a resort town just an hour from Philadelphia. This should have been good news for Angelo Bruno, whose organization had long controlled gambling in the region. The new casinos represented an enormous opportunity for those with the right connections. But Atlantic City also represented a threat. The New York families were interested in the new gambling mecca too. They wanted in on the action. And Bruno, true to his style, was inclined to accommodate them rather than fight over territory. This did not sit well with some of his lieutenants, who believed that Bruno was giving away what rightfully belonged to Philadelphia. Resentment had been building for years. Bruno's prohibition on drug dealing was resented by those who saw the enormous profits being made by others in the narcotics trade. His willingness to share Atlantic City was seen as weakness. Ambitious men within the organization began to wonder if perhaps the Docile Don had become too docile. Meanwhile, the disco that Philadelphia had helped create was becoming something else entirely. Saturday Night Fever exploded onto movie screens in 1977, turning disco into a mainstream phenomenon. The small clubs where the music had been born gave way to massive venues. The underground culture that had nurtured disco was swamped by the mainstream attention. And then came the backlash. By 1979, disco was facing a fierce reaction, culminating in the infamous Disco Demolition Night at a baseball stadium in Chicago, where fans destroyed disco records in a near riot. The movement that had seemed unstoppable suddenly seemed fragile. The music coming out of Philadelphia was changing too. Philadelphia International Records, which had dominated the charts in the early and mid-70s, was struggling to maintain its position. The payola scandal of 1975, in which Kenny Gamble was fined for making payments to obtain radio airplay, had damaged the label's reputation. Key artists and producers were moving on. The distinctive sound that had defined Philadelphia's soul was giving way to new styles. For Frank Rizzo, the end of the decade meant the end of his time as mayor. The city charter barred him from running for a third consecutive term, and his attempt to change that charter had failed spectacularly. In 1979, he watched as his successor took office, the power he had wielded for 8 years slipping away. Rizzo would spend the next 12 years trying to get back into office, running again and again, coming close but never quite succeeding. The city that had elected him in 1971 was changing. The demographics were shifting. The coalition that had supported him was no longer large enough to win citywide elections. He would die in 1991, still running, still seeking the office he had never stopped wanting. The Philadelphia that had existed in 1970, that had seemed so permanent, was giving way to something else. The row houses in South Philly were emptying as younger generations moved to the suburbs. The Italian market still operated, but the character of the neighborhood was beginning to change. North Philadelphia was even more devastated than it had been at the start of the decade. The factories that had once employed tens of thousands were closed or closing, and on a spring evening in 1980 on a quiet street in South Philadelphia, the era of the Docile Don came to a sudden and violent end. Angelo Bruno had just returned from dinner at one of his favorite restaurants. He was sitting in a car in front of his row house on Snyder Avenue, the same modest house where he had lived for decades, smoking a cigarette. His driver, a man named John Stanfer, sat beside him. A figure approached the car from behind. There was a shotgun. There was a single blast. And Angelo Bruno, the man who had maintained peace in Philadelphia's underworld for 20 years, was dead. The murder was not sanctioned by the national leadership of organized crime. The men responsible, Bruno's own lieutenants, who had grown tired of his cautious ways, would themselves be killed in retribution. But the damage was done. The peace that Bruno had maintained was shattered. What followed was 2 decades of chaos and violence in Philadelphia's underworld. Bruno's successors were murdered, one after another. The family tore itself apart in internal warfare. The discipline that had characterized Bruno's reign gave way to a kind of anarchy that made the streets more dangerous than they had been in generations. The 1970s in Philadelphia were truly over. What remains of that world now? The Italian market still operates on 9th Street, though the character has changed. Mexican and Vietnamese vendors now outnumber Italian ones. The row houses are still there, but the extended families that once filled them have dispersed. The neighborhood that kept its secrets has shared them with newcomers. The music lives on. Philadelphia's soul is still played, still loved, still influential. You can hear its echoes in contemporary rhythm and blues, in hip-hop samples, in the work of artists who grew up on the records that came out of Sigma Sound Studios. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff are recognized as legends, their contributions to American music secure. The buildings where history was made have been preserved, mostly. Sigma Sound Studios operated until 2002, before closing its doors. Its legacy assured, the historical sites that drew visitors for the bicentennial continue to draw them today, the story of America's founding still resonating with people from around the world. And the memory of that era persists in the people who lived through it, the men and women who were young in 1970, who danced to the sound of Philadelphia and navigated the city's complicated streets, who lived through the Rizzo years and the Bruno years and all the turbulence of the decade. They carry those memories still. The Philadelphia of the 1970s is gone, but it is not forgotten. Every city has eras that define it, moments when the forces that shape it come together in ways that create something distinctive and unrepeatable. For Philadelphia, the 1970s was such an era. The collision of music and politics, of organized crime and working-class struggle, of racial tension and cultural creativity produced a city that was unique. It was not a paradise. Far from it. The problems were real. The suffering was real. The injustices were real. But it was alive in a way that cities are not always alive. It was generating something, creating something, becoming something, even in its struggles. And that is worth remembering. That is worth telling stories about. That is worth returning to on quiet evenings when you want to travel somewhere beyond your everyday life. The 1970s in Philadelphia. A time like no other. A place like no other. A story that deserves to be heard. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's journey, dear friends. I hope the stories have carried you somewhere interesting, somewhere that made you think and feel, and perhaps see the world a little differently. If you are still awake, perhaps drifting towards sleep, let me remind you that your support keeps these stories coming. A like helps the channel grow. A subscription means you will not miss the next journey we take together. And a comment telling me where you are watching from or what stories you would like to hear next helps me know what matters to you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share these histories with you. Sleep well, if sleep is where you are headed. And know that there are always more stories waiting, more places to explore, more voices from the past, eager to be heard again. Until next time, dear friends. Until next time.